Time and again, people in positions of power and trust had the chance to stop the transmission of those infections. Time and again, they failed to do so.
The Prime Minister said the infected blood scandal had knocked hundreds of thousands of lives off course. Will those lives and all the hurt and devastation ever be repaired? We'll be joined by one of the leading campaigners for justice in the infected blood scandal, Dame Diana Johnson, by the chair of the Health Select Committee, Steve Brine, and by Matthew and Jennifer, a son and mother affected by the scandal. Also tonight, how will the dynamic in the Middle East be impacted by the call from the ICC senior prosecutor for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Hamas leader in Gaza, and by the death of Iran's president? We'll be speaking to experts to find out what, if anything, could change in the region. And in Mark's final film for Newsnight, our diplomatic editor reflects on 3 decades of war reporting.
We've come to northern Kuwait, close to the border with Iraq, to the area where Saddam Hussein kept his armoured divisions in reserve.
Good evening. Successive governments going back to the 1970s made deliberate attempts to lie and conceal the infected blood scandal. That is the damning, shocking verdict of Sir Brian Langstaff, the chair of the long-running inquiry that finally reported today. The Prime Minister called it a day of great shame for the British state, politicians, civil servants, health professionals. Did what happened make a mockery of the Hippocratic Oath? Do no harm. Instead, as Rishi Sunak said, to our eternal shame, they allowed victims to become objects for research. As for compensation, he said, whatever it costs, we'll pay it. First, here's Kate.
Harm which cannot adequately be put into words. That's how the chair of the Infected Blood Inquiry today described the events which led to around 3,000 deaths and 30,000 life-changing HIV and hepatitis infections. When questions of compensation were first raised almost 40 years ago, the then Health Minister Ken Clarke rejected the idea, saying there had never been a scheme to compensate the unavoidable effects from medical procedures. Today, the inquiry reported the treatment disaster could and should largely have been avoided. Sir Brian Langstaff said patients were knowingly exposed to unacceptable risks of infection. Now, to understand this question of avoidability, we can look at 2 children's hospitals, either side of the Pennines. Alderhay in Liverpool, like many other centres, treated children with haemophilia almost exclusively with blood clotting proteins created by pooling plasma from tens of thousands of donors and often imported from the US, where paid donations came from high-risk donors like drug users. Alderhay treated around 14 patients a year. In 1987, they reported 16 had been infected with HIV. Those in charge at Sheffield Children's Hospital, on the other hand, worried about the risk to patients and instead specifically chose to use as little concentrate as possible, preferring alternative treatments or, when required, NHS-produced products. It treated slightly more patients and saw just 1 infection. In the words of the report, they all had the information they needed to do better. They did not use it. In consequence, children suffered. They did not need to do so.
All the evidence points to a single, inescapable conclusion: that children and adults were not treated in a way which prioritised their safety above other considerations.
More broadly, the report finds it was known blood could transmit hepatitis when the NHS was created in 1948. By the late 70s, it was clear cases of what would later be named hepatitis C risked serious long-term consequences. But despite almost a decade of discussion, the UK didn't introduce screening until September 1991, when a direct test was available after 23 countries had got there first. And while the inquiry finds everyone involved in treating patients either knew or should have known of the risk of HIV transmission by the end of 1982, heat treatment to eliminate the virus wasn't introduced until the end of 1985. Now, the inquiry doesn't blame one decision or one organisation for this. Instead, it documented a catalogue of failures, including doctors who didn't adequately inform patients of the risks, slow and protracted government decision-making, the organisation of the blood services, and incorrect decisions by the licensing authorities to not suspend the importation of commercial products. The inquiry also finds the harms done were compounded by what happened afterwards. Successive governments closed ranks and denied wrongdoing. The answer to the question, was there a cover-up, Sir Brian Langstaff concluded there had been. Now, this isn't a movie. There weren't a handful of people plotting a conspiracy. Rather, the inquiry describes the truth being gradually hidden over many years. Politicians, it finds, repeated inaccurate, misleading and defensive lines.
3 lines were repeatedly deployed by successive governments. That people had the best available treatment, that the infections were inadvertent, and that screening for hepatitis C could not have been introduced earlier than September 1991. All of those claims were untrue.
And while some documents were lost with time, the inquiry finds on the balance of probability others relating to the delays in screening for hepatitis C were deliberately destroyed in an attempt to make the truth more difficult to reveal.
Mr. Speaker, more than 3,000 people died without that truth. They died without an apology. I want to make a wholehearted and unequivocal apology for this terrible injustice.
The current government is also criticised for causing widespread distress, as it has yet to set out a compensation package despite accepting the moral case. That is something Rishi Sunak now says will happen tomorrow. The infected and affected will also have to wait for a full response to the inquiry's recommendations.
Kate there. Well, I'm joined now by mother and son, Matthew and Jennifer Mary. Matthew was infected with HIV while receiving treatment for haemophilia in childhood. His mother also acquired hepatitis from infected blood. Dame Diana Johnson, the Labour chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee, who spearheaded legislation through Parliament to get victims quicker access to compensation, and Steve Brine, the Conservative chair of the Health and Social Care Select Committee. Good evening to you all. First of all, Jennifer Mary, you've lived with this for 4 decades and waited for this for 4 decades, but today, did it make a big difference to you?
It did, yes. The apology was something we'd been waiting for a long, long time. It seemed sincere, and I hope those words are soon put into action as well.
Can you tell me how you found out that Matthew and his brother were infected with HIV?
On a railway station. My husband Philip and I were waiting, we think, for a train, because even now we don't know why we were there, because it was such a shock afterwards. And this lady came up. She'd got a young boy at the same hospital, and she asked us if we'd had a letter. And of course what she didn't realise was that if we said no, she'd got to tell us, and we said no. And then she said, well, in that case your sons are HIV.
And your sons at that age were what, 6 and 9?
Matthew was 11 and Simon was 8.
Matthew, can you remember being told what was going to happen to you and what was happening to you?
Yeah, well, I remember being told by my mum and dad that I was HIV positive, and I was 12 years old at the time, and that was absolutely devastating, because it was that time in the mid-80s where the AIDS adverts were on telly, and there was a huge stigma around it, and it was a death sentence at the time. There was no two ways about it.
And of course you had a little brother who was in the same situation.
Yeah.
What did you think might happen to you? I mean, you presumably had lots of questions to ask, but didn't know who to ask them of.
Well, there was no one to ask. We were essentially left to go away and essentially die. There was no help ever offered, or no help ever given. And actually ended up going to see a psychologist at Great Ormond Street Hospital in 1990.
What, you were 16? Just
16 at the time. It was just after 2 weeks after my 16th birthday. I've got the report here, and part of it says, it's very likely indeed that over the next few years, even if he does not develop AIDS, he will suffer major emotional difficulties. He will have to adjust to the possibility of a shorter than normal life and a period of chronic ill health. And that was the facts back in the early 90s.
Meanwhile, you were having to administer factor VIII.
Yes, yes. Yes. It's awful because, first of all, I gave them this, I'm a carrier, so you feel that guilt. And then you have the next guilt is because you probably infected them with it, with the injections. And it's just awful, dreadful. I mean, you're pouring poison into your own children's arms.
But Matthew, you had no idea what you were being given. It wasn't as if that, your mother was doing the best that she could do in the circumstances.
No, it was just the treatment that the hospital gave us to deal with our haemophilia.
And what about the records? Do you have all your records?
No, so when the inquiry, or when there was news of an inquiry starting, I applied to all the hospitals I'd been at for my records, and most of them had been destroyed. In fact, all of the records, because my mum and dad kept separate records, because it was about 1982, and there was these stories coming out of blood-borne viruses. And when I got all my records, or what was left of my records back from the hospitals, all traces of American Factor VIII had been removed from those records. And we know we were given American Factor VIII because after my mum and dad got the news me and my brother were HIV, they tried to give us more American Factor VIII. And my mum refused it, didn't you?
Yes. And when I went in there and I went to get it, he put this box in front of me and I saw it was American. This is only a few weeks after I'd been told that they were HIV positive. And he turned around and said, but they're already infected. You might as well have said, well, they're going to die anyway. So I said, well,
that was the only, that was it. They're already infected with this American Factor VIII, so.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Do you think, do you think that there should be prosecutions? That
if this had been done earlier, yes. I don't think there's the people that aren't alive now, personally. If there are some, yes. Yes.
I think the file should be passed to the CPS. There must be people still alive that had a hand in this, and I think they need to be prosecuted. This was not an accident, and I think the wording where it says it's a tragedy or anything like that, it almost makes it sound like an accident. This was done on purpose. This was done with full knowledge of the risks.
And as we now know of today, and for the purposes of research, things were going on in the NHS that were detrimental to people that had the same issues as you had.
There was you were never given any choice. There was never a discussion over risk.
Steve Bryan, what about the idea of passing the report, passing all the research to the CPS?
Yeah, justice delayed is justice denied. And, there's no stop clock on justice. If there are people alive and there is an evidence base, which looks very much like there is to me, then I think the CPS have a duty to be interested in this. I mean, what I would say is, just listening to you both, my heart's beating just listening to you, and I've met many people in your position over the years, and we knew today was going to be like a tsunami, and we've been talking with my clerks and my select committee on the health committee for several weeks about how we were going to respond to this and how we as a committee will scrutinise this work going forward. It's a bit like a tsunami in that when it hits, it's going to really hit, but when it makes land, it's got a hell of a punch to it. And today has had an incredible punch to it. And given the delays to this report that there's been, and the sort of Maxwellian procedure they talk about, where everybody's criticised it had to go back to, I think that was ominous in terms of the punch that this was going to pack. And boy,
and what did it feel like for you, Diana? Because you've been campaigning for this for so long.
I think it was a very emotional day for everybody, actually.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And finally, the truth was told about what had happened and the cover-up. And I think that was so important that acknowledgement was given, the tragedy and the cover-up.
And do you both acknowledge that there's, problems and blame on both sides of the political divide, that this is successive government? You both acknowledge
this is a failure of the state. I wrote down
that's so interesting that the idea of national shame It's something that I think that's probably the first time that a Prime Minister in recent times has said, this is national shame, this is a national failing.
We were both in the chamber today, weren't we? And it was a very short statement, and it was incredibly sombre. And I just wrote down, the three things I wrote down was the Prime Minister said it's a day of shame for the British state. At every level the institutions failed, and whatever it costs. Now, for a British Prime Minister to say that at the box, that's big news, that's a big deal. And actually, I thought he was incredibly sincere today. And I know him and I know Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, well, and I know in their heart they will make this right.
But they'll make it right. But actually, Sir Brian Langstaff hasn't made recommendations that are binding, has he? I mean, that's...
he hasn't, no. But last April, he set out very clearly the recommendations on compensation. So as much as I think the Prime Minister today was sincere in his apology, actually, a year ago, he was told by Sir Brian, people are dying, you need to get the compensation paid. And actually, the delay of the government for the last 12 months has further compounded.
Do you accept that? Because there has been inaction.
I think as well, it's been a continuation of a lie, of lying for 40-odd years. Because even last year, when they had Sir Brian Langstaff's second interim report, we were being told, we're working at pace.
Yes.
They weren't. They were doing nothing. They were lying to us. All over again. And it takes a report like this to get Rishi Sunak to stand up and admit what has happened.
And there was dragging the feet over the levels of, not the levels of compensation, who was in the compensation, as it were, arena.
Yeah, and Diana has this tradition at the end of term, every term, that there's a UQ in the name of Dame Diana Johnson on this subject. And I've spoken in your UQs many times. And you're right, a year ago was a moment when actually a gesture could have been made, and it wasn't.
But for all you say that it's extraordinary to hear the Prime Minister, should he have actually said, I take responsibility for delay and inaction in the last year?
He should have done, actually, because ultimately he's the Prime Minister, and if the Prime Minister wants something to happen in government, he can make it happen. You know, they've done this with the Horizon scandal. They decided, because of the outpouring of disbelief of what happened when that TV drama was aired, they took action. They could have done this a year ago if they'd wanted to.
Well, I mean, he's the Prime Minister.
And Labour could have done it. And Labour could have done it when they were in power.
Yes,
Let's be quite clear.
I just want the government of the day now to do the right thing.
I wonder if you have confidence that it couldn't happen again with blood products.
I don't think so. I think because I heard that the blood products laboratory has been sold off to a private investor, and that is so that is just puts profit back in to the blood products, and that's where it got us here in the first place. American companies trying to get profit out of people giving blood.
Well, it is possible, of course, you can go after big pharma, you can go after pharma, go after the American companies supplying factor VIII, and somehow explain to you and many others why the presence of the American factor VIII was removed from records. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, and that's why the word cover-up is constantly used. I mean, in terms of the never again and the learn the lessons thing, I mean, we on the Select Committee at the moment are doing this leadership in the NHS inquiry, and where that started was a piece of work that Jane Dacre, who runs the expert panel that advises us, was looking at previous public inquiries where they've made patient safety recommendations and the government have accepted those recommendations, and we found that actually time and again recommendations have been made, repeated, and actually not carried through. So what I want to know now is that systemically they will follow each recommendation through.
Yeah, but the thing is that the phrase should never be allowed, which is called learn the lessons, because learn the lessons doesn't mean anything. But it was foreseeable and it was preventable. So was Grenfell. To a certain extent, so was COVID. You know, what is the problem at the heart of the state?
Well, I mean, I've reflected on this a lot in recent weeks, as you would imagine, and I sort of think, well, is it that this is a new country and we're not very good at statecraft? Clearly not. Is it that we don't have good people who can dig into these sorts of failures? Clearly not. Therefore, it has to be that it is cover-up, and it's what the Chancellor spoke, I think, very openly about in yesterday's newspapers, about the ranks being closed around public servants. And Theresa May said that in the House today.
I also think it's a complete lack of personal accountability. There is no one that will take personal responsibility for this, and it's all hidden in groupthink.
Because they think, again, there could be a prosecution of
Yes.
And the thought that, too, that just to keep somebody's reputation, hundreds of people died. Because
Thousands?
Yes, thousands.
And
just
money.
for somebody's reputation.
And I think money comes into this as
Yes,
well.
it does.
Because there was a view this would be very expensive if you actually admitted something wrong had happened. And I think the reputational damage and the money were the two reasons why the state closed ranks and said, nothing to see here, we did the best we could.
I mean, so I want to get back to Matthew in a minute. From the political perspective, what happens next?
Well,
tomorrow,
procedurally, a statement tomorrow from the
tomorrow.
Cabinet Office Minister. And remember, when I was a Minister of the Department, this was taken away from the Department. Theresa May was frustrated. She's since spoken publicly about why that happened. She brought this into the centre of Downing Street.
We had to fight to get it out of the Department of Health, because when the public inquiry was called, the sponsoring department was going to be the Department of Health. And that was totally unacceptable, because the Department of Health are at the heart of this.
Because they shouldn't have been marking their own homework.
Absolutely. So there had to be a fight, though, to get it into the Cabinet Office.
So procedurally, tomorrow is a statement from John Glenn, I presume, from the Cabinet Office Minister. And, I mean, John knows more about this than me, but my concern is not about getting immediate compensation to the infected. It's the complications and the complexity of getting it to the affected. And I worry that that is going to take forever.
Another thing that could have been done over a year ago is registering all the affected people.
Completely agree.
And that was not done. That hasn't,
outrageous.
that has not even started.
The preparatory work.
So what would make a big difference to your life just now? You were telling me earlier that you're not on drugs at the moment for HIV, that you are essentially well.
Yeah.
But what would make a difference to your life going forward?
Well, I think this is the start of the end of this, because we've been living this for 40 years. I've grown up, my childhood, I had HIV. I was told in my 20s I had hepatitis C. And I was told in my late 20s that I was also exposed to variant CJD through blood products.
Oh my God.
So it's not a clear run for the rest of my life. There's still clouds hanging over my head. And, I want to be in a position where I can make my family secure. I can't get life insurance. I can't, if I died tomorrow, how would my family cope? So I need to be in a position where my family's future is secure.
And you're going to make sure that happens?
Yes, we are.
Oh boy, I mean the Select Committee corridor is going into overdrive here too, because as I said, I want to make sure that accepted recommendations from the past are actually followed through. If I hear learn the lessons tomorrow, which I suspect I will, there will be deep sigh in the House. And if I hear that we're going to now start setting up the register, there'll be an even deeper sigh. And I suspect we will hear both of them, but we will be following this up, and Sir Brian's work will not be left on the shelf.
And it's cross-party as well.
Completely.
This is not one side, this is the House. The House wants to see justice.
Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, into the maelstrom of the Middle East have been added two significant developments. Today, the chief prosecutor in the International Criminal Court announced he was seeking arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and his defence minister, along with Hamas leader in Gaza, Ismail Haniyeh, and two other senior Hamas figures for war crimes and crimes against humanity. This follows the confirmation that Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi had died in yesterday's helicopter crash, along with the country's foreign minister, prompting mourning in public and some celebration on social media. That raises the question of whether the deaths make any difference to Iran's role in the Gaza conflict, providing Hamas with indirect military backing. I'm joined now by Mark. Mark, first of all, what has the ICC's chief prosecutor set in motion?
Well, what he's asked for is arrest warrants. He can't issue them. The request goes to a panel of 3 judges who have to make this decision. Now, they might say they've done this decision, or they might keep them as so-called sealed arrest warrants in order that the people concerned wouldn't become aware of them. Now, they concern the 3 leaders of Hamas, as you've mentioned, Yahya al-Sinwar, Mohammed Daif, both in Gaza, and Ismail Haniyeh outside Gaza. They, according to the prosecutor, have a case to answer. They could be charged with murder, rape, and kidnap, so very serious. Also, of course, as you mentioned, 2 key Israeli leaders, as was explained this afternoon by the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan.
But so where does it go?
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant bear criminal responsibility for the following international crimes committed on the territory of the State of Palestine from at least the 8th of October 2023. The crimes include starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, serious injury to body or health, or cruel treatment.
So where does it go from here?
Well, look, we've seen a lot of reactions today to what's been done, this sort of plague on both your houses as we're approaching the ICC, starting off with the Czech Prime Minister. Now, he weighed in. I think we can see something that he put on Twitter. Probably we can see that in the screen, maybe not. But he weighed in pretty much straight away, saying that he found the whole kind of moral equivalence of this unacceptable. We must not forget, he tweeted, that it was Hamas that attacked Israel in October and killed and injured and kidnapped thousands of innocent people. Now, there were some supportive statements from some governments, Belgium, for example, saying no one must be above the law. But the White House and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK have also been critical in this sense of what they've been calling moral equivalence of having both Hamas and Israeli leaders. Now, the wider question, of course, is where does it go from here in the more literal sense? I talked before about the need to actually get this through the panel of 3 judges for warrants to be issued. Can they be executed?
Well, exactly. I was going to say, how do you go about executing this kind of warrant?
Well, so many of the key countries involved, Israel, critically, are not signatories to the statute that established the ICC. Qatar, where Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas political leader, who's also subject to these charges today, also isn't a signatory. Neither is Turkey, another country he goes to often. Neither is Iran, that we'll be talking about. So it's quite possible that these individuals, even if open warrants are issued, will still continue to operate politically and move around the region.
But yes, but I mean, restrictions on movement, presumably, depending on what airspace, depending where you land, depending where you refuel.
If Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to get on a plane to go to the US, OK, the US wouldn't arrest him. They're not parties either to the Rome Statute. But what if the plane developed a technical fault and touched down in Ireland? You know, those are the kind of issues that somebody now, if it goes ahead with arrest warrants, could potentially face.
Let's just briefly talk about Iran. You know, a change in leadership ahead. You know, what is ahead for Iran apart from elections, obviously?
Well, I mean, that is the clear thing. The 50-day timetable for the first deputy to the dead president to arrange these elections. I think the key questions, I'm sure we'll hear about it in a moment from Ali, is just to what extent does this now provide a window for frenetic politicking for the people around the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, to try and fix this in the best way they can politically? Clearly, it's an entirely unexpected political event.
Stay here now, because for more I'm going to be joined now by Nomi Bar-Yaakov, Associate Fellow in the International Security Programme at Chatham House, and by Ali Ansari, Professor of Modern History with reference to the Middle East at the University of St Andrews and the Founding Director of the Institute for Iranian Studies. Thank you both for joining us. Let's just go back to basics here, Ali. What were they doing putting President Raisi in such an ancient helicopter?
Well, that is a question that I think many Iranians will be asking as well. I mean, not only putting him in such an ancient helicopter, but deciding to fly in such bad weather conditions in a mountainous area. So I think those questions will be asked, even amongst some regime loyalists.
So does it going to make any difference? I mean, as Mark said, we've got an unexpected election, but will it make any real difference to policy, not least, for example, hardline policy, particularly towards women?
I mean, most of the policy is derived by the Supreme Leader. So the Supreme Leader sets the strategy and the outline. I mean, Raisi was particular in his loyalty and his reliability to the Supreme Leader, but he's not an originator of many of these ideas. So I think the Supreme Leader would be looking quite earnestly for someone who was as similar as he can find to Raisi to take over the role.
But Nomi, what Raisi was very much behind was the idea of acting as proxies in the Gaza war.
Correct. Not only in the Gaza war. I mean, he was also supporting the Houthis in Yemen. He was supporting Hezbollah in an unprecedented fashion and various militias in Syria and Iraq. And true, they were all acting against Israel. And he's also, a great executioner. He issued thousands of execution orders towards anyone that showed any kind of dissent. He was, as Ali said, a tremendous hardliner, but I think the policy is not going to change. I think they're going to keep everything very tightly in Iran under wraps. They've set a date for elections, the 28th of June, and it's unlikely to be a sort of democratic process whereby you're going to see a lot of campaigning and stuff. I assume everything will be decided ahead of time by the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and I think it's going to be much of the same.
So let's now turn to the International Criminal Court and the role of the chief prosecutor. Has there been the expected reaction in Israel? Horror, the idea that there's absolutely nobody that would ever think this is a good idea.
I think, well, Israel, A, isn't a signatory, and B, they feel that they haven't exhausted local remedies. Yeah. And I think the issue of exhaustion of local remedies is fundamental.
Do you think, though, that it will have the impact of shoring Benjamin Netanyahu and indeed Gantz up?
I think that's the risk, that it will give them, they already feel, or Netanyahu feels, hounded. That's part of how his whole modus operandi. He just feels that the more he's hounded, the more extreme he gets, the more dangerous he gets. And so I think there is a risk, and then of course there's a risk that the voters will sort of shift further to the right, as in feeling that no one understands the state is the sort of narrative that one is hearing there.
What about the both pleas? We've got the plea for the both Hamas and the Israelis in a kind of moral equivalence.
Well, I mean, I don't think moral equivalence is a helpful way of looking at it. I do feel at the end of the day, though, even as for the Israelis as a democracy, that they do have to maintain certain moral standards. And I do think that any military action at the end of the day has to be framed within a moral and political framework. And so in that sense, there is a moral standard to follow.
Mark, on that whole question about this ICC move, what impact would it have potentially on negotiations?
It's always very difficult. I mean, we saw going back with the issuing of arrest warrants on Slobodan Milosevic during the Yugoslav war and on Muammar Gaddafi during the events of 2011 in Libya, that in those two cases, it sort of gave them no other way out than to fight on. Now, obviously, Gaddafi died in the final stages of that conflict. Milosevic was later handed over by a changed government in Serbia for trial in The Hague. And possibly, this is what opponents of Benjamin Netanyahu hope, that when the government is changed, there could be some sort of deal. But right now, as we've heard from Nomi, the possibility is that it polarizes things the other way and that, it doesn't have that effect. So it's quite hard to predict how this will play out.
What do you make of the accusations? You've got the accusations, arrest from Hamas for kidnap and rape, and you essentially have got the indictment, if you want to put it that way, of Benjamin Netanyahu for using starvation as a weapon of war.
Well, again, I think that the issue here is that what is the political framework of what he's doing? I mean, what is the end game? And at the moment, I think even the criticism within Israel, I think, is that he hasn't really provided a sort of a political end game for what is going to happen to Gaza afterwards. So I think at the moment, what the problem is that you're seeing essentially the devastation of Gaza with no sort of possible solution in hand. If the Israelis could develop and actually provide that and say, as Jake Sullivan and others have been asking for, then I think that would ameliorate it to some extent.
But does this move by the ICC, in a sense, weaken it? Because if it's something that cannot be executed in any way and is going to be rejected by everyone, not least America, for the idea of moral equivalence as well, then it shows that the ICC is essentially, although I take it what happened in the former Yugoslavia, toothless.
There's also the question of what is the impact on the ICJ case, which is running in parallel. Because, interestingly, in this particular request for arrest warrants, there is no mention of genocide. And you've had a panel of experts, with the top leading experts in this country. You've had Lord Justice Adrian Fulfro, you've had Elizabeth Wilmshurst. They're the authors of this particular report, which I'm holding here, which is the panel of experts of international law. It's it's on that basis that the declaration today and the request for the arrest warrants were made. So all the evidence that was reviewed has been reviewed since January by 5 top lawyers in this in this country, and Theodore Meron, who's not based here. So I think there's been a very rigorous process in terms of hiring the top international lawyers, possibly I would say in the world, to examine the evidence and before any decision was made. And now it's going, as Mark said, to a pre-chamber of 3 judges. They are going to have to decide whether to issue the arrest warrants or not. And that hasn't been decided yet. And I think so it's not decided yet whether to issue arrest warrants or not. If they decide to issue arrest warrants, then there'll also be sort of a lot of toing and froing. There will be everybody, meaning both Hamas and Israel, will be questioning the jurisdiction of the court. The court has stated, the ICC has mentioned that Palestine is a state for this purpose. But at the same time, they're mentioning that Hamas is a non-state actor within the state. So exactly. So there will be a lot of questions asked.
And we will be discussing lots of them. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as you may know, Newsnight's format changes next week, and as a result, there'll be a parting of the ways with some valued members of the team. Mark is one of those leaving the BBC after more than 3 decades in this programme, covering conflicts and diplomacy worldwide. We asked him, along with his longtime producer, Maria Polachowska, who's also leaving, to reflect on how today's world differs from the one he began reporting on all those years ago.
We've come to northern Kuwait, close to the border with Iraq, to the area where Saddam Hussein kept his armoured divisions in reserve. Kuwait, 1991. The United States crushed Iraq's armed forces, and as they tried to flee, the Americans kept bombing.
I thought some of them would put up some kind of defense. I mean, if they love their country as much as we do, I thought they'd try to fight for it, but they just didn't know what they were up against.
The US sent more than 500,000 people and 1,000 aircraft to fight. Some said the unequal slaughter had made America a hyperpower and ushered in a monopolar world. But the logic for maintaining the huge military forces that did this would soon collapse. When a coup attempt by hardliners against Mikhail Gorbachev collapsed in Moscow, it spelt the end of the Soviet Union and many of its symbols. Has gained access to the Central Committee complex. The Soviet Communist Party was outlawed. We managed to get into the Central Committee building that night and found it already deserted. In the shredding room, evidence of the apparatchiks' attempts to save themselves. The machines have been stuffed to overflowing. On top, an account of party privilege, listing departments and individuals in receipt of special foods and other perks. As the ideological divide that had dominated the world for 8 decades crumbled, economic turmoil and shock therapy overtook Russia. Capitalism had apparently triumphed. Just a few years later, as Britain prepared to hand its last colony, Hong Kong, to China, some had such faith in capitalism that they thought Hong Kong might consume the People's Republic by touching off a democracy movement.
Hong Kongers like ourselves are looking forward to a very bright and prosperous future, very much thanks to the British.
But as we've seen, although it took 2 decades to happen, China eventually suppressed the student democracy movement. And its enormous economic strength meant that Hong Kong was subsumed, not the other way round. China prioritized its economic growth, while America had to deal with this. The US found itself responding to Al-Qaeda's 9/11 terrorist attacks, ushering a decade of highly destructive conflict.
Well, we're pushing into Dura, which is a district in the south of Baghdad.
In Iraq, a war of choice, the US expended enormous amounts of blood and treasure and ended up opening the door to wider Iranian influence, while causing the American public to reject a role as the world's policeman. And for those who yearned for that moment, now we see the consequences. Instead of a monopolar world or a two-sided rivalry like the old Cold War, we have one where several large states contest for economic and strategic advantage, and where chaos is increasingly widespread. In Ukraine, independent since the Soviet collapse, they face an existential struggle. Interstate war has returned to Europe. Hundreds of thousands have been killed or wounded. Russia, animated by nationalism rather than communism, gambled on Western indifference and weakness. Well, we haven't been here long, but we're getting a good idea about the constant rockets and defensive fire from the Israeli Iron Dome system. In the Middle East, one of the few constants of these past 35 years, the Israeli-Palestinian struggle proved resistant to peacemaking and has at length now brought a terrible war to Gaza. Further afield, Iran has used its proxies at this moment of turmoil to try to push the Americans out and extend its own power across the Middle East. And while China and India might be very satisfied at the growth of their economic and military power during these past decades, the United States is beset by its internal divisions, all the more so as this election year proceeds. Many people in these border states believe they want him back in office precisely to finish that job. The rhetoric might be about making America great again, but the reality of a heavily indebted federal government, a public tired of foreign adventures, and deep social schisms is that the world's most powerful nation is turning inwards, and the contest to fill the vacuum it's left around the world keeps on intensifying.
That was a flavour of some of Mark's brilliant reporting. That's all from us tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. Until then, from all of us here, good night.